Less than 24 hours ago, Palestinian militants sent rockets across the border and entered Israeli towns, gunning down and capturing citizens on a Jewish holiday. A bulldozer was filmed tearing down a section of the Israeli-Gaza border fence. The Hamas fighters rolled into more than 20 locations, in some places roaming for hours, as Israel's military scrambled to respond. Israel says that at least 200 people have been killed and more than 1,000 injured. Israel has responded with waves of airstrikes into Gaza, flattening multiple buildings. In Gaza, health officials have reported that more than 230 people have died and more than 1,500 are injured. ABC correspondent Nick Dole reports from Jerusalem.
There's a major operation underway because those Hamas militants, they remain there. They continue to keep hostages at gunpoint after their extraordinary raid this morning. Unfortunately for Israel, some of those militants have taken some of the hostages that they captured into Gaza, and we've already seen some videos of some of those hostages who have crossed the border. This was a complete surprise to people in southern Israel. This is a country which for years has prided itself on its ability to protect itself, particularly its civilian population. There is a huge military and intelligence presence around Gaza and focused on Gaza. So the fact that this was able to happen, this attack that had extraordinary planning, that'll be a question for Israel's defence and intelligence chiefs in the coming days. But right now, the focus certainly is on those civilians. The operation that the IDF has launched today is likely to continue for some time.
What
happened today was never seen in Israel, and I won't let it happen again. The entire government is behind this decision. The Israel Defense Forces will immediately use all its strength to destroy the capabilities of Hamas. We will defeat them to death and take revenge for this black day they have inflicted on the state of Israel and its citizens.
There is a much bigger and ongoing question about how this was able to happen. This certainly was not an act of opportunity. This was very carefully planned. It would have taken months, if not years. Not only did we see people crossing by land and barging through Israel's border fences, we also saw people, some coming in via sea, and at least a few paraglider-type craft in the air. Now, it's difficult to even get those that kind of equipment into Gaza, given Israel's ongoing blockade, but that would have required training, that would have required some skill, and the fact that things like that were happening in Gaza right under Israel's nose will be a huge source of concern for the government and for civilians there as well. Certainly the scale of the attacks we've seen from the IDF just in the last few hours, I would say, will degrade the Hamas militants' ability to launch further rockets, or at least anything of the scale we've seen today, because a lot of targets were hit, and we're still not sure exactly what they were or who was affected. But yes, certainly Benjamin Netanyahu says that this isn't just something that will be wrapped up in a day or two, that they will continue hitting targets until they can be sure that the threat, in their words, is neutralised.
Former Australian ambassador to Israel, Dave Sharma, says that the situation is likely to have major consequences for the border region.
Israel clearly did not see this coming. The fact that Hamas went in both on the ground by breaking through the border fence, by air, using sort of motorised vehicles, and by sea as well, and were able to hold and occupy and run rampant throughout many small Israeli towns in the south for several hours before the IDF mounted a response, shows you that they had no idea whatsoever that this was coming. You've got Hezbollah, which is in southern Lebanon, but an Iranian proxy of sorts, which has already come out and welcomed this offensive. You've got groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the West Bank and other militant groups which have also welcomed this, and Iran itself has welcomed these horrific attacks we've seen. I think it's quite possible that some of those actors will seek to take advantage of this situation, the disarray within Israel, the fact that the nation is in a degree of panic to capitalise on this. And we saw Joe Biden earlier today just warning states seeking to take advantage of that. But there is a very real risk that this will escalate into a much wider regional conflagration. It's almost definitely scuppered any prospects of an Israeli-Saudi peace deal, and that may well have been the intent behind this, because groups like Hamas, groups like Hezbollah, countries like Iran were going to be left on the sidelines and in a weaker position if Israel normalised relations with Saudi Arabia. With what's going to happen now and the mood that will be on the Arab street when they see the inevitable Palestinian casualties that result from this conflict, I think that will make the diplomacy of that task impossible now.
As part of the attack, Hamas fighters have taken an unknown number of Israeli hostages into Gaza. A warning, this story may be distressing to some viewers. This verified footage shows a woman on the outskirts of Gaza City being dragged out of the vehicle barefoot with her hands tied behind her back before being bundled into the back of the Jeep and driven off. Both Hamas and the Israeli Defence Force have confirmed that hostages have been taken, but that number does remain unclear. For more on this story, I'm now joined by Nasser Mashni, who's the president of the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network. Mr. Mashni, thank you very much for joining us. According to Palestinian media reports, the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas told the US Secretary of State that, quote, injustice towards Palestinians has driven conflict with Israel to this point. What injustice is he referring to?
Thanks firstly for having me on today. The injustice he's talking about is the fact that Palestinians have been subject to an Israeli war for 75 years, Miriam. For 75 years, day in and day out, the images that you've just shown have been occurring, but the victims have been Palestinians. And we don't get to see those on media and in the West. That injustice has been going on since the creation of the State of Israel, and Palestinians surely have the same rights as every other people to self-determination.
What has led to this point in particular in recent times in terms of expanding settlements in the region and an escalating tension leading up to Saturday?
Well, if we just look at the past week, take yesterday out of context, just at the past week, we've had an Israeli minister, Smotrich, calling for an entire village to be wiped out. We've had 5 Palestinians killed, 4 by the army, 1 by a rampaging, pogrom-like settler group that had killed a Palestinian boy, a 16-year-old boy. They've destroyed crops, stolen stock, burnt down houses and cars. The situation in Palestine is just unbearable. In the past couple of days, we've had the storming of Palestinian religious sites, the Dome of the Rock, the Islamic Dome of the Rock, but also Palestinian churches. There's vision being circulated widely of Palestinian Christians and other Christians being spat on by Israeli settlers. The situation in Palestine is just horrific. This is Miriam, a day-by-day war by Israel on the Palestinians. And to expect no reaction from the Palestinians is just to beg a belief.
We spoke about the last week, but for our viewers who might not understand the context, the wider context of this conflict, can you talk to us about how it's evolved historically from the Palestinian perspective?
Well, from the Palestinian perspective, we were made to pay for the crimes of the Holocaust. Palestine existed, the Palestinian people existed, and a settler colonialist enterprise, Zionism, and Israel was created, and Palestine disappeared almost overnight in 1948. And what we have now is Palestinians who are indigenous to Palestine, to that land, who are not invading. They're not invading, they are wanting to go home. Within the Gaza Strip, 2 million people, 70% of them are refugees who live a day's walk to their ancestral lands. As Palestinians, we empathise with our Ukrainian brothers and sisters, but when Russia invaded Ukraine, we immediately knew who the bad guy is. Palestinians are not the bad guy. Palestinians just want to go home. They want to live like everybody else on earth and enjoy the self-determination. Know that if they send their children to school, they'll come home, have dreams and hopes of international travel, international education, opening up their own businesses and living freely. And that's being denied to them by a brutal Israeli regime, aided and abetted by Western governments who say things like Israel has a right to defend itself.
Well,
don't Palestinians have a... Mariam, can I just say, don't Palestinians have a right? Don't Palestinians have a right to defend themselves, to live freely?
On that point, Mr. Nasser, I'm going to take you to our Prime Minister, who reacted to the outbreak of war as it's been described. Let's see what he had to say a little earlier on our programme, Insiders.
Well, this is an abhorrent attack on Israel. This is indiscriminate. Civilians being targeted, killed and murdered, and as well, many of them being taken as hostages. This is a dreadful circumstance.
As the President of the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, how do you feel hearing the Australian Prime Minister express his unequivocal support for Israel?
Look, I'm disappointed that there wasn't a mention at all of the thousands of Palestinians held captive by Israel. Children as young as 10 years old are snatched in the middle of the night from their mother's arms, taken to Israeli dungeons, questioned in a language they don't understand, made to sign confessions in a language they don't speak. But where's the condemnation of Israel's actions? Palestinians are an occupied people. We're indigenous to that land, we're natives to that land. I'd like our government to speak out about our rights. There are many Australian Palestinians and many Australians, overwhelming majority of Australians in fact, according to our polling, who are on the side of justice for the Palestinians. Palestinians are calling beyond the realities of governments and their desire to speak up for Israeli rights. Palestinians want the International Court of Justice to come in and investigate. Investigate Palestinians, and if we're guilty, hold us to account. But come and investigate the Israelis, come and investigate what they're doing to Palestinians.
Mr. Mashney, what do you make of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's comments a week before Australia is due to go to a referendum centred around reconciliation with our own Indigenous people? Do you draw any parallels?
Well, there are many parallels. Our Indigenous brothers and sisters here on this continent have been the subjects of brutal settler colonialism. Palestinians have suffered the same consequence, and we stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters here on this unceded Aboriginal land.
And just lastly, before we go, Mr. Mashney, does the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network condone the violence and bloodshed being inflicted upon Israelis by Hamas?
Mariam, we condemn all violence. Violence is no solution. The Palestinians have been asking for justice for 75 years. We've negotiated. The White House lawns handshake of President Arafat, Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin was 30 years ago. 5 years after that, now 25 years ago, Palestine was supposed to have a state. Israel only has to abide by international law. Since then, 25 years since Palestine was supposed to be a state, 750,000 illegal Israeli settlers live in what's supposed to be Palestine. There are no Palestinians in there. They have their own roads. They have their own laws. Palestinians use the Israeli shekel, lick postage stamps that have David Ben-Gurion's picture on it, Israel's first Prime Minister. The world is waking up to the fact that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid. International human rights organisations are agreeing with it, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. Israel's own two preeminent human rights organisations, B'Tselem and Yesh Din, both charge Israel with the crime of apartheid. It's past time for the world to wake up and help the Palestinians achieve their just rights to self-determination, to live peacefully and freely in their own lands. Palestinians are not children of a lesser God. We're entitled to the same freedoms as anyone else, and anyone that expects that Palestinians have to have less so that Israelis can be safe are just racist, and that's unacceptable in today's age.
Nasser Mashi, the President of the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, we thank you very much for sharing your insights here with us on ABC News.
Thank you so much, Mariam.